Hello and welcome to Itinerati Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and this is episode 25. It's Empowering Authorization Through Data, and I'm pleased to welcome guest Eric Anderson. Welcome, Eric.
Thanks, Mike.
And Rogerio Rondini from the Netherlands. Welcome, Rogerio.
Thanks, Mike. Good to be here.
So before we get started, I just want to remind everybody to follow Identirati Office Hours on LinkedIn. We're trying to get to 1,000 followers, so follow it. Tell your friends to follow it. That helps us get the word out. And this week, I think is sort of an interesting topic because some of you might know that I started on the data side of this business, and I was in the directory services area, and that's how I ended up pivoting into access management. And so when Eric approached me about this topic of how important it is to get the right data for your authorization policies, it really rang true to me. And so I'm excited about this topic. But before we dive into this, maybe we can just have some quick intros from our guests. Eric, maybe can you start? How did you find yourself on an Identirati Office Hours live stream?
So I've been connected to you for well in excess of 10 years. I personally started in this space as well. Just like you, I started in the infrastructure and data side of things. I was a directory services guy. And I guess one would argue that I'm still a directory services guy, but I've ventured into the realm of I'm a process guy that happened to get into technology. So I do a lot of practitioner work. I do a lot of actual delivery pro serve, helping establish data virtualization, stuff like that. I do a lot of those different things. As of the past 10 years or so, I've worked in all of your major fields, all your verticals, financial, retail, restaurants, federal, financial, government, all of those good places. And what I'm doing these days mostly is I'm doing a lot of identity virtualization. So thus leading us to the identity fabric or the identity data lake.
Cool. And Rogerio, maybe you could do a quick intro too as the co-host today. You're in the Netherlands. How did you get forked into identity?
Sure, Mike. Actually, thank you for having me here. So I've been working in IT for about 25 years, but specifically in identity. I started in 2009. I was working for Sun Microsystem by the time, and we all know Sun Microsystem was one of the first to create a product for authentication and authorization, the web single sign-on, and the role-based access control. So it's been 15 years working in identity. I'm from Brazil. I started in Brazil, then I moved to the Netherlands 7 years ago, and here am I.
Awesome. So Eric, you're in the hot seat today. Tell us a little bit about this topic. What made you think about authorization and data and how they're related and why we should be talking about that as Identirati?
So one of the things that I've found interesting, and I've been in all kinds of large clients from, again, federal financial spaces to large structural banks to retail, health insurance. I've really been almost everywhere. And one of the things that really speaks to me as a practitioner is the amount of struggle that goes into trying to maintain clean data. There's all sorts of effort and spend that goes into stuff like multi-factor authentication and stuff like that, because obviously those are fairly low-hanging fruit to help short circuit finding yourself on the news, right? But there is the business wants to manage the data where the business wants to manage the data. And it's really hard to influence how they want to manage it, even though different business units across the enterprise often need to leverage that data. whether it's for authorization purposes or for, personalization purposes. So one of the things that I've focused on is putting together a very intuitive, high quality, high validity data service that allows you to get the correct data at any given point of time. And doing so allows me to connect it to, for instance, authentication and authorization services like Glue, or whatever it is that is whatever's consuming it, because whatever service you're using, wherever you're issuing your token, has to consume the right data. Otherwise your access decision isn't going to be as high quality as it could be.
Let me show a diagram. I have a diagram. I should have prepared this before. Let's see if it works. Yeah. So this diagram is it's got to be from 2010. That's how. But I used to, let me turn the caption off here. Caption. So this diagram was how I used to talk to customers, because customers would always conflate identity management and access management and governance. And what's interesting about this is that I always put directory services at the bottom. And I would say to people that, unless you have the right data, all of these systems basically are useless. And so, and the better job you do at creating a foundational identity service, the easier it is to make connectors for your identity management system for provisioning, the easier it is to do access management and get those claims to the access management system correctly, and the easier it is for your governance system to actually report on and run campaigns against the quality of this. But is this diagram still accurate, you think? Or
100%, because if you think about it, so in my view, the difference is there's all sorts of different kinds of different data elements that are necessary to make good decisions around access, right? You have credential information, you have the actual control information, control assignment, you have behavior around where it is that the request is coming from. There's all sorts of different pieces of information that you need to have in a predictable location. You need to know how to get to it, and you need to be able to get a response to it in microseconds, right? That's where the intuitive nature of data management comes into play here, because as it stands right now, there's always the right information someplace in the enterprise, right? But the business likes to manage it. Everybody has this everybody wants to manage their own data. They like to control their own fiefdom. They control this particular element of things. And it's very difficult to ascertain which one of those is the most authoritative source. But in my early days in identity, I kind of like Rosario, I go back a minute or two. I started in IAM before there was an IAM, as my oldest daughter liked to put it, all the way back in the 19s. So and I remember back in, like the ballpark, what was that, around 2000, DirXML 11A, and you would go through and you would ascertain which data element was authoritative, priority. This concept allows us to do that on a much grander scale. So if you're familiar with the notion of master data management, you can effectively you can build a framework that says, I'm going to connect to these 27 different data sources. This data source 1 holds these pieces of information, data source 2, these pieces of information, data source 3, these pieces of information, and all the way across the gamut. And then you look at each one of those elements in your data inventory and you prioritize them. Which one is the most authoritative? So option 1 is this, option 2. So you develop a depth chart if you're a sports fan, I guess. And in the event that you don't have a source here, you have one here, or you have one here, and you get down to the highest quality data element that you have, and that's the one that you expose. And so, in my opinion, that is it's critical to be able to provide that information to the enterprise as a whole to make it so that they know where to find it. That's the hardest part.
Rogerio, maybe you could jump in. I can put you on the spot. You have vast experience with lots of enterprise corporate environments. What do you see as some of the challenges around managing data and getting it into one place? And how has that changed like over the years from your experience?
Yes, definitely. I think it has been changed over the years. So if we look in the past, authorization was mostly based on static key elements, so based on groups. And as we cross to the CM domain, consumer identity, we have different type of requirement for authorization. So the complexity is how to define or how to identify what is application data, what is authorization data, because most of the time they intertwine, right? They cross the path between authorization and application data. For example, if you wanted to authorize or check before a user do a banking transaction, if it's allowed or not based on the amount, so then you cross to application data. And I think this is one of the most complex nowadays when building master data record. So how to define the source of truth, how to maintain this data and combine into a master record.
Right. What data is even necessary? Like, I think that's an important point is like when you talk about building a data service or a data lake, or what was your phrase, Eric? You had a data fabric.
Yeah, data fabric.
What goes in that fabric, and how do you differentiate between what's application data that's only needed by one application and what's identity data that we need in the fabric? And how do you wouldn't that be something you need to do early on?
So I have to tell you that one of the most engaging and entertaining conversations that I've had in the entirety of my professional career was on what is identity data. Because the notion of what is identity data, you can put 100 identity professionals in a room and they're not going to have the same answer. And I've actually done this a couple of times. I've spoken in something like 50 cities in the US, and I've actually gone out and I've facilitated this conversation, and it's so much fun. But you have personalization data, right? And sometimes that personalization data, there's like core identity, your belly button, and then there's what kind of preferences you have, personalization, like how you prefer to be communicated with, where you can be reached, and you have different application layer, different application data about what should happen in this particular context. And, all of those different pieces of information are all relevant in the grand scheme of application operation, right? In what makes the master data management or, master user records so profoundly useful is that all you have to do is basically you identify that this piece of information is useful, and you identify the source where it comes from, and you key that source. As long as you have a key, we can key that source and we can join it onto the record. And so that means that I can take, if you have 20 different LDAP directories and you have 15 different databases and 10 different web services, if I have a key, I can tie all of those together and take the entirety of that data footprint, prioritize each of those data elements so that we know, it's kind of like an exchange for email address. If you're issuing, I can't tell you how many times I've seen companies use HR as the authoritative source for an email address. HR isn't the authoritative source for the email address. HR gets that from Exchange, for instance, right? So you're choosing the wrong authoritative source. So this model allows us to say, this is the top priority for this particular data element. And we piece it all together. And now we have this massive it gets to be a large record. Like, let's be clear. You're holding all of the data that the business finds useful. We're able to stitch together, and then from there, we can expose slices of it. So all the way back, all the way back in the early days of identity, there was the notion of a filtered replica, right? So that you only exposed, if you were coming from the outside, you might not expose these data elements. If, even though you had a core object, you might have a core identity, but for this particular consumption pattern, you might only expose 10% of those attributes. We can do that same thing. We can not only can we limit this data via ACI, should we choose to do so, but we can also make it so that the view itself doesn't expose it at all, which means that we can maintain those levels of separation. So for instance, you're familiar with ACI in the context of directory. If you're not coming from this particular application, you don't get access to that particular application's customization data, for instance, the attributes that come from there.
Right. Are you talking about workforce only, or does this also expand into consumer?
So in my view, they're very, if you look at this from a process perspective, and as I mentioned earlier in this conversation, I'm a process guy that happened to get into technology. From my perspective, they're materially different, but only because of scale and complexity. So on the CIAM side, you have very high volume with very low complexity, typically, because you have lots of identities that have, fairly simple entitlements. And on the enterprise side of things, you have fairly low numbers of identities, but you have very high level of complexity because you have so many controls. And frankly, there's a lot of space in the middle there, because you have portal applications where you might have users that are, that have to log onto one system, and you're enabling communication and workflow between internal and external people and stuff like that. So those lines are not as clean as one might like. So in my opinion, it's one great big continuum, and where, just it depends on how much complex, the volume of users, and as it relates to the volume of complexity.
Right. Rogerio, from your perspective, what do you see as the current state of things today? Are customers, in the old days, I think that this approach that we would create almost like a virtual directory where we have a consolidated, we use a correlation identifier or some type of primary key to then merge from other. This approach has been around for a while. But we've had so much change in the IT architecture going to cloud. And now I hear there's a company called Dagster that works in data pipelines. So there's been so much change. Rogerio, what's your take on the current state of the market? Are customers still pursuing this, and what are they doing instead if they're not?
Yeah, I think overall customers are still, let's say, using the old-fashioned way. Let's put it like that. So directory server as an old-fashioned way. I'm not sure if you agree to this statement, but I've seen clients trying to move to the data pipeline, right? But once we start to implement a identity solution, then it will end up on a directory server, right? So the data pipeline, it's
Maybe it's
great.
time to get off Ping and ForgeRock because they're only offering you LDAP. So yes, it's always finding its way to LDAP
Exactly.
miraculously.
So that's actually bring me to a question, like, is it directory server the right data store for this complex data model, right? Because
But
we are.
how where it gets stored is irrelevant. My question is not whether it gets into LDAP or RDBMS or NoSQL,
Mhm, mhm.
but Arc, do you see? To me, this seems like really like a foundational thing that you need to do. But it doesn't mean companies actually doing it. Are companies still making projects to make a consolidated view of identity, like an identity fabric? And if they're not, what problems does that cause?
Yeah, I think it's very little, at least the experience that I have. As I said, there are I had clients trying to implement a data pipeline, but the problem is exactly how to combine the data pipeline where when you have to use a directory server to authorize to create to do claims-based authorization, and etc. So I think there is a gap between you building the data pipeline, you build your master record, and how identity tools are still using the old-fashioned data model.
So, Eric, it sounds like you have a specific solution in mind. So, I'm a big fan of Radiant Logic. I love that tool. I love not just the ability to do the mapping, which is great, but the ability to do transformations. So, sometimes you get a piece of data, and let's say it's an LDAP group DN, and that's not exactly, and DNs are useless. That's to maybe an application that needs the name of the group, not the DN of the group. And so what I loved about Radiant is that it enabled us to make these complex joins across disparate data sources like LDAP and RDBMS and web services, but also to do transformations. So I'm wondering, is there a specific tool set that you're thinking about, or are you neutral on the tool set, depending on the client and their preferences?
So it's kind of funny that you bring them up. I wasn't going to say any vendor product
We're
myself,
okay
but
talking
you're
about
the
vendors
host.
here.
You're the
Because
host.
we're
So
professionals. We use these tools. We need to know what the tools
Yeah.
do.
to be clear, Radiant and full disclosure here. It's Radiant that I do professional services for. I
Yeah.
talk about this from an architectural perspective because I am a very, very strong proponent of the notion of abstraction as an architectural principle.
Hmm.
Nobody puts IP addresses into their code anymore, right? There's a reason for that.
Hopefully.
The Actually, I shouldn't say nobody. There are still some out there. I've seen them recently, but Radiant. One of the things that I love about the Radiant solution is that you're absolutely right. I can take one body of data and I can publish it. There are limitations with regard to the access protocol. So, for instance, the LDAP access protocol has limitations, stateful. It creates challenges from an infrastructure perspective that you don't necessarily. Application teams want to move towards more of a REST call, right?
I have
The
to
great
say,
thing
just
about
to pick on LDAP a little bit, and by the way, Glue doesn't support LDAP in production anymore. We're off the LDAP bandwagon. Um, but the biggest challenge that I see with LDAP is multi-value attributes. LDAP is so great at multi-value attributes, but it transfers well to JSON, but it really doesn't transfer well to RDBMS. So that's the one sometimes impedance mismatch I see with how LDAP handles data and how other types of ways of storing data might deal with it. But yeah, okay, so yeah, Radiant is great, but Radiant is also enterprise software. Are there any other options? Like my opinion was Radiant practically had a monopoly on this market. There was OVD, Oracle Virtual Directory, but it just wasn't as good. Is there anything else out there?
that is still, in my opinion, that is still very much the case. There are other solutions out there. I want to say there's a couple of different virtual directories out there. There's a little bit of virtualization in Ping. There's a little bit of virtualization and there's OVD is obviously gone away, but it's now OUD, I think. And there's still
Yeah,
some
who knows?
virtualization.
Yeah, and
And
just a quick side note on the ping tool. And I love Unbound ID, which is now Ping Directory. I think it's the best LDAP server ever written, and I love that team. They're the greatest team, one of the greatest teams of programmers. But that tool is very code oriented. One of the things that's great about a Radiant is the productivity that you get because they built these great developer tools that make it very easy for you to productively build these things, not necessarily the fact that it moves data around. That's what
right.
every programming professional does, but how productive they've made it to do that. So
And
props to Ping for, and the directory team, but that sync tool is not Radiant. Yeah.
Right, and that's why I bought Radiant back in 2007 or whenever it was at the health insurance company, because I'm not a developer. I'm an architect. I'm a virtualization architect, but I am not a developer. I do not write Java code as a general rule. I hack Java code,
Yeah.
but I do not write it typically unless I have absolutely no choice. And the ability to have, from a business perspective, the ability to have one body of data and access it, whether it's via LDAP or via REST, is critical, because it's the notion of coming back to stratum one data, right? You don't want to have a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy to be able to point back to a master user record that is directly scalable and consumable is immeasurably powerful in the enterprise. And to Rogerio's point, it is true that there's a lot of challenges around how that data is consumed and stuff like that. The thing that's always important to me, I am a strong advocate of the notion of externalization in the context of access management. So I personally am a strong advocate of externalized access decision, like a decision service policy and decision point, and how that architecture fits together. Obviously, you have the ability to point, you should have the ability to point to a data service that can be consumed in any fashion that they want it to, as long as you can make it perform. And that's where I think that the identity virtualization and the master user record really comes together in Rogerios and your position, because you can put all of it together and you can access it any way that you want.
Yeah, one thing just to touch on that, I've seen. So we all know some vendors and their products, but in the context of policy-based authorization, so they are going away from the virtualization on the like you said, but basically the central authorization component provides multiple type of connectors, so you connect it to the data source. So the virtualization, I think in this context, it would happen within the authorization component uh, without the need to build a directory virtualization. I think that's maybe one way to go.
And I think that there's a lot of truth to that with regard to like zero trust, right? So you get issued a token, and that token goes with you, and it has information about you and about your level of trust and all of that fun stuff. And it's stateless, so it can move. It can be consumed in any number of different contexts. And if the decision point doesn't have the information that it needs, whether it's baked into the app or an externalized service, it can make a call to wherever to get more data. I think that you're right in that we're feeling our way out into different patterns, and I think that that's good, because I think that it helps us learn, right?
Yep.
So far in my experience, the biggest thing going for the data service, the master user record, identity fabric, identity data lake, whichever term you prefer, is the notion that it can become so intuitive. It becomes something. I like to joke. I like to joke about naming your service, right? Because you want to make it so that application developers and business people in the enterprise alike know where to go to get the data. And I personally, it's funny. I'm kind of a simple fellow sometimes, and I love the notion of naming your identity data service PI. People information exchange, personalization, person information exchange, whatever it is, however, but everybody loves pie, right? So it becomes the kind of thing that is very easy to market inside, and it makes it so that people remember it, and they remember that there's this service out there that has all of the information that you need. And if they remember that you exist, it's half the battle.
When I first ran into Radiant Logic, it was in the context of SiteMinder, because SiteMinder needed to make an LDAP call in order to get attributes. And it would be nice if that LDAP server just had all the information we needed from all the
Right.
various sources. But over the years, what I've seen is that there's been a transformation where, so in that, if we were looking at PDP, PEP, PIP, in that case, the LDAP server is the PIP. It's the policy information. I don't know what that last one P stands for, but anyway, it's
Point, maybe?
where the
Point.
point, yes, policy information point.
Provider,
And
maybe. Provider might work.
I think point is right. Policy information point. That's right. Then the policy decision point. Right. So the LDAP server was the PIP. And recently I posited, we've had a lot of authorization talks here on the live stream already. And there's really been a renaissance of authorization. And I posited recently to David Broussard that is the JWT the new policy information point? Because a lot of these new tools are using the JWT as the input to the policy. And so the claims are being transferred. The PEP and PDP is not connecting directly over the network anymore, which doesn't work from a microservices perspective. You can't have any network calls. So all the information's coming in the JWT itself. So I would argue that in a way, this data fabric, you would say, well, maybe it's not as useful. But then on the other hand, that central service is still minting those JWTs and still needs to put all that information from those various sources into the JWTs, which get minted. But any thoughts, Eric, on how sort of this new distributed architecture might align with this architecture of building a PII, a personal information
I believe that they dovetail
infrastructure?
perfectly because, to your point, it is true that it is especially in the context of zero trust, you're attempting to provide all of the information necessary inside that JWT to make it so that, you don't necessarily, if you can provide all of the necessary contextual information in that token, then you don't have to make a second call that you have to wait for a response on, right? Is the way that I look at that. But to your point, you have to have that data available to you to mint that JWT in the first place. So that means that the data has to be wherever it is that you're issuing that token from. So you make a call to your PIP and get the information, which gets bundled up into the token, the JWT, and sent on to where it is that it belongs. So I believe that those architectures fit absolutely perfectly into this reference architecture, where you don't necessarily have to change the process to make an external call if you can provide the information up front, right? So I think that it absolutely bolts right up. And I'm actually a big fan of the notion of, I'm a big fan of XACML. I actually spoke at one of my favorite presentations that I've done in my career actually was I spoke at the Axiomatics sales kickoff in 2017. And it was a lot of fun.
I think David Broussard has even moved on. He's pitching Alpha now as a new.
Right. It's been a minute, but yes, he left and came back, so he's back at Axiomatics.
But XACML was definitely really important to provide. Without XACML, we don't get to these new
right.
Technologies. Probably, yeah.
Right.
Rogerio, so in the data field, what do you see as the challenges that customers are facing? Because there's enterprises are such a diverse group, and there's no one size fits all for something like data or identity in the enterprise space. What do you see some of the challenges that enterprises are facing in the data area and feeding those authorization policies with the most up-to-date data?
Yeah, I think, well, it's to maintain the data with a quality enough to be able to be used by a policy, a framework. I think data quality is still a topic, and it's become more important as soon as we move to a data based authorization, let's put like that. So we need the data, but the data needs to be in a good quality, need to be trusted. So I think, yeah, data quality is the challenge still.
And so Eric, one of the challenges that I found working in the field is not only correlating the data, but sometimes deduplicating it when there are multiple systems, maybe dumping data in, creating duplicate identities, and then having trouble disambiguating or getting a result. Do you see what are the challenges that you see customers struggling with most now? And is it just getting a quality record, like Rogerio says, or are there other challenges along the way?
So in my view, this is the value of creating that MDM, right? That master user record, because one of the huge problems, in my professional opinion, is that you have all sorts of data sprawl. There's so much duplication of data, and it's not all created equal. But when you have those systemic rules to be able to key them together and prioritize the source, I can absolutely take, for instance, if I get the same record back 25 times, if I get the same value for the same attribute back 25 times, I'm only exposing one. So what that means is that I've taken the entirety of your footprint and I've shrunk that data footprint, because to your point, you don't need 25. You don't need the same value 25 different times, right?
Well,
The
from an
other thing,
authentication perspective, you need only one. It has to be a deterministic
that's
answer.
right. Right. And so the question is, how do you piece that together? And within the magic of data virtualization, that's where I've had so much success, is that I can perform a union join to, based upon my core identity, right? So that I can pull it from any one of 25 different sources, and then grab all of the sources from each of those places that hold information that match that key, and then it's just a depth chart. Now, another thing that is really, really an important, since the cat's out of the bag, and we all know that I've been discussing, virtualization and Radiant. The other thing that I find to be ridiculously powerful is the ability to clean that data on the fly. So
Like I was saying, transform, yeah, or clean is a better way to put it, probably, yeah.
Right. Nobody likes to hear that their room's a mess, right? Um, but the ability to standardize how that data is exposed. A great example, I was in another lifetime, it feels like, I was at an employer that was migrating to Office 365. And at the time, the phone number was authoritative out of PeopleSoft, or I guess I already said it and it's live. So it was authoritative out of the HR system, right? And everybody has a different opinion on how they like, it's a preference of how they like their phone number to look, whether it's number, dash, number, dash, number,
Yeah.
or, number, dot, right? Or number, slash, number, dash. Everybody has different ideas about what it
Yeah,
is that they like.
Europeans love dots, Americans hate dots. Yeah.
And Microsoft hated them all. So we originally, pumped all of this data up there, and I think Azure AD is just like, no, absolutely not. Absolutely not. So one of the things that's amazing about this is that this is an example use case. Obviously, there's applications that are written that cannot handle various characters, special characters. We know that exists across the enterprise. One of the things that is most powerful, in my view, about the ability to transform that data is that I can take that value, I can strip it, I can strip all of the non-digit characters and reformat it so that they all show up in one format without destroying the original record. So the ability to take that data in and expose it in a different fashion without having to destroy the original data means that that action is very low risk, right? It's non-destructive. So I don't have to damage anything. We're not responsible for changing it. We don't have to make, nobody's alarmed by the fact that we have to change this stuff on, we can simply virtualize it, change it on the fly, and the business can consume it however they like.
Yeah. I always used to say to customers, well, it's just a cache of the data. We're not changing your data in your database. This is just a cache. And somehow that makes it more palatable to the data owners, that you're not changing it. I think that's true. You can normalize without causing any political waves.
Absolutely,
So,
because the human condition says that everybody wants to own their data. I did a little bit of consulting for a life insurance company that it took them in excess of 30 days to onboard people because there was this one department that was simply unwilling to relinquish the ability to an IGA or a normal identity lifecycle solution. They were completely unwilling to relinquish it. They had to onboard that because they were going to own that data. And that's human nature. If you're responsible for something, you want to be able to, hug it and squeeze it and call it George, and you want to be able to take care of it and make sure that that nothing has happened to it, and so you're the only one that gets to touch it. And the notion, the prevalence of that, when you get into a lot of enterprises that are very decentralized, they struggle with who owns this data. And with a virtualization engine, that political struggle doesn't have to happen. I can take all of that information, I can pull it in, I can name it appropriately, and I can expose it to only the people that are supposed to have it. And because of the fact that they're still able to update that data in the database, just like they refuse to change, right? That data can still be updated in the fashion that they want, but it can be exposed and provide value to the enterprise at large.
right. Well, we try and keep these things to 45 minutes. I'm going to put on my pigeons. Oh, look, I'm okay. So I'm sorry. I'm trouble tracking the chat because I find if I watch the chat, I don't pay attention to my guests. But we can continue this conversation on the LinkedIn thread. And I see a lot of great comments here. So audience, we will take this conversation offline and continue it. Maybe we'll do some last thoughts. Rogerio, you want to start last thoughts, just summary before we wrap up?
Yes, sure. Well, it was really an inspiring conversation, and also thanks, Eric, for bringing such important topic. I believe the authorization will continue change and evolve over time. We've seen now the relationship-based authorization, which brings to a new type of requirement to build the data records. Some tools based on graph like Zanzibar or Indicate is coming to the market with this proposal. So yeah, there's a lot of work to do on the coming years.
We have an OpenFGA talk coming up, which is one of the more popular graph-based tools. And hopefully I'll get Lhasa on one day. I have a back channel conversation with him. I think he's up for it. Eric, before we
Great.
break, any last thoughts?
I guess that the thing that I love the fact that we're continuing to talk about authorization. We're continuing to talk about data quality and data validity. Context is everything. The context of data, the context of the request, the context is absolutely the most critical component of access. It is the most, and data and context matters. And so I think that having these conversations is really important to be able to drive that message home and to see that identity doesn't have to be as, in my opinion, identity doesn't have to be as complex as it's often made.
Okay, well, thank you, Eric, for bringing this topic. As I mentioned, this data topic, I think, is often overlooked, and it's a garbage in, garbage out scenario. If we don't have good data into our authorization policies, those authorization policies are worthless. So it's an important topic. Hopefully, we'll have more conversations about it. Next week, next Thursday, we have a conversation about shared signals and CAPE. This has been one of the most requested topics. So looking forward to this conversation on Thursday. Please join us. Don't forget to follow Identirati office hours. I want to thank my guests so much for sharing their experience, and we'll see you all next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Mike.